Yeah, you're live.
Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to day 4 of the Alumni webinar series. Today we have with us a very distinguished TISB alumnus, Mr. Harsh Desai. Mr. Harsh Desai went to UPenn for undergrad and he went to MIT Sloan for his MBA. So it would be great if you could start by introducing yourself.
Thanks, Abhigyan. Hi, everyone. My name is Harsh. I graduated from TISB in 2009, and as Abhigyan said, attended Penn for my undergrad. I majored in mechanical engineering and minored in math and entrepreneurship, and have worked in consulting and PE, and now going to join investment banking after graduating from Sloan. So that's me in a nutshell.
Perfect. So to delve right into the questions, how did you choose which colleges and majors you applied to?
Yeah, sure. So for me, it came down to paying attention to what I liked studying in school, and trying to extrapolate from that. So I took physics, chem, and math high level in the IB, and a lot of that came down to the fact that I really liked physics, and math was kind of okay, but I knew I had to study it. And I put those two together and decided I wanted to focus on engineering in undergrad. And that's what led me to apply to engineering courses at different schools. So that's how I decided what to study. And as far as where to apply, honestly, a lot of that for me, was based on rankings and school perceptions. So I had never been to the US before I joined Penn. So I didn't really have a feel for how college campuses are or how different they are from one another. So I basically just went by what seemed to be kind of the best schools that I could have a shot at getting into and applied to those.
So it's great to have you here, considering that you did get into one of those best schools you applied. So what lessons did you learn from the application process itself that you think would be useful to share?
Yeah, sure. So I think, there were a couple of things I would emphasize that I think I did that helped me, and I've seen other people do as well when I was applying to college. I think the first thing is you should, and this is somewhat obvious, but I think it pays to start a little early. And what I mean by that is the essays that we have to write to apply. A lot of them are written by pretty similar people overall. So if you think about it, your peers at TISB are not that unlike you, and in general, international students, even if they come from different parts of the world, tend to have similar experiences in general at good schools before they apply to college. So something to think about, I think, that helped me was how I could position myself slightly differently. And what helped with that was just having time to reflect on my experiences at TISB and on what I liked about them and what I wanted to kind of show about myself to the admissions team at wherever I was applying. So I think having that time up front actually helps you craft convincing essays, because that's essentially what you're trying to do, right? You're trying to convince someone who has never known you and will only know you on this piece of paper for now, that you are interesting enough to be a part of the conversation at the college that they represent. So I would say start early and kind of focus on your strengths when it comes to presenting yourself and writing about yourself. So that's one piece of advice. The second piece of advice I have, and I think this is pretty valid, is diversify. So I think there's there's kind of a limit on how many schools you can apply to, which makes a lot of sense, because if you didn't have that limit, you'd spin your wheels kind of endlessly. But I saw a lot of people who chose to kind of put their eggs in a few baskets, and it ended up working out ultimately. But for some people, it didn't work out as well as it could have theoretically. So I would say, kind of branch out, think about not just the 5 schools you would kill to get into, but also, 5 others that you'd be, okay going with because they're still good schools, and maybe 2 or 3 on top of that. So whatever the limit is, come close to that, I would imagine is something that you should do. And then last piece of advice really is submit before the deadline because I actually know some people who didn't do that, and that does not work out well. So those are my 3 kind of pieces of advice. Start ahead, apply on time, and kind of give yourself a good range of schools to apply to. Happy to dive into any of those with either of you.
Awesome. And I know it's been a really long time since you applied to school. So, I mean, remembering and recalling and giving us this advice is really, really valuable. So maybe on a more personal basis, why did you select UPenn and MIT? Maybe you can speak briefly about each of them. And maybe given the choice, would you change your decision? Would you maybe want to go somewhere else? And is there anything else you wish you would have known before you started college there?
Sure. It's a great question. So I'll start with Penn because I think that's probably more relevant for you guys. The reason I chose Penn, frankly, was this will sound a little silly, but I thought, just looking at all the colleges that I'd gotten into, it was essentially the highest ranked one. So that was kind of number 1 for me at that time. And 2, it seemed to have, I went to a lot of these college discussion boards online and started reading about the different colleges once I got into them. And it did genuinely seem to have this culture of, very smart, very talented and competitive people who also kind of take the time to be social and get to know their peers over the course of 4 years. So that seemed like something I was interested in. And then to narrow it down further, I didn't want to go to the UK then. So that kind of cut out some of the UK schools I'd gotten into. And within the US, I preferred the East Coast to the West because, my thinking at the time was that it's closer to home and it's still pretty far. So, it's a small difference that way. But I basically looked at schools on the East Coast that I'd gotten into, and Penn was the best one. And also I thought lined up well with what I wanted out of my college life. So that led me to picking Penn as for undergrad. You mentioned MIT, and that's business school, and that's actually a fairly different ballgame. When, like some of you will go to business school, I assume some of you won't need to or won't want to. But I would say the advice for that is just, apply to the good ones because the other ones, it's very expensive. So it's not sometimes worth it, frankly, sadly. And then kind of pick the one that lines up best with what you see yourself doing in the future, because different schools have different strengths when it comes to your post MBA employment prospects.
Thanks for providing the rationale behind your choices. So now moving on to some questions about college life itself. So what was your expectation or idea of college before you went in your head, and how significantly did the reality at Penn differ from your idea of college life?
Sure. This is actually a good one. So I went into college, I would say somewhat blind. I mean, I knew I was expected to work hard because, it's college and it's competitive, etc. But I also figured there'd be a lot of opportunities to to get to know myself better at some level as a person, and also make a lot of new friends, have kind of new experiences in a different country. But other than those kind of broad ideas, I didn't really have a lot of preconceived notions or expectations about college, which I think actually really helped me, because when I got there, I wasn't comparing Penn in my head to kind of this ideal college experience. It was more like I wanted a few things in my experience, and I kind of expect to have those fulfilled. And was a pretty low bar, honestly. When I got there, I think what was different from my expectations or what surprised me was honestly how academically intense it was. I think my idea of U.S. colleges for some reason, and I blame partially the movies I watched as a kid, was that it was basically just one massive party, and you didn't have to study that hard to do well. So when I got there, I realized that people were actually studying a lot more than I was, and the workload was quite intense. And I wanted to go in and do something athletic as well. So I tried out for the rowing team and was able to get in. But over time, balancing that with studies became pretty intense. So I'd say that was one thing that really surprised me. Well, it shouldn't have, but it did. Was how intense the workload can be, and how much of your time just kind of goes into managing your day-to-day academic work. The other place where I think Penn was different from what I had experienced in the past, and I guess what informed my expectations accordingly, was the city that it was based in. So I'd never been to the US. I'd never been to Philadelphia before I showed up at Penn on day one. And I imagined that all American cities would be a little bit like New York or San Francisco, basically, which I'd only seen in pictures and heard of. So Philadelphia was pretty different, not necessarily in a good or a bad way, but it's a smaller city. It doesn't have as sizable kind of an economy backing it as New York or SF or Chicago do, or a bunch of different cities, frankly. And so what was surprising to me was kind of seeing this, I guess, slightly a city in decline almost at some level. I hadn't expected that. But that being said, there were, it's a fantastic place to be a student in because it's inexpensive and it has a lot of good food. So it had that going for it. But I'd say the biggest surprises were A, how intense it was academically, and B, kind of my notion of what American cities are like was very different from what Philly turned out to be.
That's great to keep in mind. And I mean, I think you mentioned not really having too many expectations. And I think that's a nice mindset to have when you're going somewhere new, just so you don't, just so you have a nice initial experience. So maybe transitioning a bit more to student life at Penn. What were the different ways people socialize? Is it mostly sports and clubs? Greek life, and maybe how did you yourself make friends while you were there?
Sure, happy to talk about that. Sorry. Right, so how people generally meet other people and make friends is, there's a few different ways you can do that, really. One is what I would call kind of the default way, which is your academic program, because you're surrounded by people who are studying the same thing. And at least for the first 2 years, your courses are pretty much dictated to you if you want to stay in that major, because there's a set progression you have to follow. So that's the first way I made friends, really, is just being on teams with people in my classes and getting to know them and getting to know, spending time outside the classroom with them in a deliberate fashion. So that was one way. The second way is kind of related, but your first year, your freshman year, most, if not all colleges, I think, mandate that you have to stay in a dorm. And this is where kind of the luck of the draw comes in a little bit, because you can be in a dorm with people that you really get along with, or you can be in a dorm with people that you really don't get along with, or you can be in a dorm with people who are just like indifferent to each other, essentially. So I got lucky, and I had the first thing happen where I was in a dorm with my roommate was great, so I picked a room with a roommate just to have someone there. So my roommate was great, and everyone else in my hall is what they called it, was very accommodating and very nice, and actually pretty easy to get along with and warm. So that's the other way to make friends. And then there are a couple of other ways, but basically what I would say is over time you join groups on campus, like non-academic groups. Like there's a Model UN group, or there's kind of an eating based group, or like a food based group, basically people who like food. Things along those lines, you end up joining those groups. I was part of a theater group, for example, which is how I made a lot of my close friends. And then there's fraternities and sororities. So there's Greek life, which even if you're not a part of, it's helpful to go to the gatherings they organize to get to know more people. And certainly if you're a part of Greek life, then that's a big way of getting to know people, because you're living with them again in one house for probably a year or two, I would imagine. And you're part of the same organization, so you go to the same events together. You kind of have the same set of group experiences, which leads to a certain amount of bonding. But yeah, so broadly, I would say those are the ways that you can meet people and make friends. Is one, within your academic program; two, within kind of your residence; three, with clubs or organizations that cater to non-academic interests; and then four is just socially, like through friends or through frats and sororities, or through other social groups.
It's great to hear that there are so many avenues to make friends. So for us, especially as Indian students, I think one of the concerns is how are the dorms and food at campus, basically. So maybe options for vegetarians and stuff like that. So what is your opinion on the dorms and food?
Yeah, it's I had a lot of friends go to colleges in the US. I don't think any of them were happy with the state of their cafeterias. And a lot of that just comes down to, I think, what you're used to eating versus what, the choices that you get suddenly. So in my experience, it's best to expect that you will be let down by the cafeteria food. And if it doesn't let you down, that's a big plus, and you can eat there, and that's kind of one part of your life sorted, because you don't have to worry about where you eat next. It's not something you think about. But I would say on the whole, American colleges, their cafeterias don't have a reputation for having quality food, or like it'll be good food, but it may not be food you like. So actually, something I did over time was should have done much more of this, but cook a little. I think it's hard to do it initially because you don't really have the time to do it. But certainly, as you progress in college, you find the time. So I would suggest picking up, at least knowing how to make a few things, even if it's just scrambled eggs and one or two other things that you like. That can be valuable. So that's on the food front. The other thing you asked about was dorms. There, I think the experience can be very variable. It just depends on the college and on the specific dorm within the college. So even in a university, depending on which dorm you are in, you can have a very different experience. And so an example of that is at Penn, I was in the Quad, which is kind of their oldest undergraduate housing. It's their original undergraduate housing from way back in the 18th century. It's been refurbished several times, obviously, but it's still not like it's very normal. There's like the rooms are small, the beds are small, your storage space is somewhat limited, but you're 18, so none of that really matters to you. Essentially, you can look past most of that. But then there were some dorms which didn't have an AC, for example, because when they were made, there was no need for one, and then it's been too expensive to get a system installed post fact. So for like 3 weeks in the spring, they would all be melting towards the end of the semester. So the experience with dorms can be pretty variable. I think the way you can try and solve for that a little is, once you get into college, kind of speak to people who are there or who have attended recently, and get a sense of what their freshman year dorms were like, and which ones they thought were the best and which ones they would avoid if they're to be back in college. So that's the way I would go about trying to select dorms, but ultimately I do know there's a fair bit of luck involved, because it's all kind of a random selection process for undergrad dorms at most schools. So you have to do your research, but then you just kind of have to roll with it as well if you get something you don't exactly like.
Absolutely, and I think that advice that you gave about learning to cook something is definitely really handy, and I think we should all keep that in mind. So, what was student culture like when you were at Penn? Were students competitive, or was there more of a focus on collaboration?
Sure. So I'll answer your second question and then go back to the culture itself. So yes, students at Penn were very competitive. Not always in kind of I'm out to eat your lunch kind of competitive, but you could always kind of feel that there were people around you who could very easily kind of surpass you if you weren't keeping up. So competitive in that sense, competitive in effort for sure, and some people competitive kind of on an all-out level. So yes, they were competitive. I would expect that any school you go to will have competitive students, just because it's a self-selecting mechanism, right? Because like in school, you're in DISB, for example, you're competing with one another, but you're friends and you're in a boarding setting, so it affects how you deal with the competitiveness. You can kind of compartmentalize it better. At least I could, in my experience. But when you get to college, it kind of, it gets a little harder in that the competition is more intense at some level, and it's also it's aggregated. So you have a bunch of high performing kids from different high schools all coming to one college, and like suddenly they all also want to be high performing kids all over again. So it can get pretty competitive, and then that's something you should be prepared for and kind of expect ahead of time, so it doesn't surprise you. Going back to the first question about the culture itself, I actually really liked the student culture at Penn. I can only speak mostly to the engineering school because that's the school I was in for undergrad. It had a pretty open culture across different majors and with the faculty. So you could, you had kind of an official faculty advisor, and you could always talk to them about pretty much anything you wanted to, as long as you got time with them. But there were also a lot of other faculty that were very interested in making sure that the undergrads, kind of all got along and didn't have any massive problems with their curriculum, etc. So you could always talk to them as well. And then I think there were a lot of kind of cultural events that you could attend, because there are different cultural groups within the undergrad student body at Penn, and they all put on events or shows or parties of some sort. So it's a very good way to get to experience something you never would otherwise. Someone else's culture is always fun to experience. So I'd say, big picture culturally, I found Penn actually very, very positive. People were always happy to help. People were always kind of open and warm on anything that you wanted to do, essentially. And they were always understanding of the fact that you weren't American, so there might be things you don't understand or you don't exactly know how to do, and they were willing to help with that. But yes, it was pretty competitive, so kind of have to balance the two.
It was great to hear that you had a positive experience. So I think one of the things associated with the place being competitive is the toll it takes on your mental health, which is definitely a concern for those of us applying to top universities. So how do you think are the mental health facilities at UPenn? Are many students unable to cope with the pressure, or can they manage?
Yeah, it's very relevant, and honestly, I think it applies no matter which school you go to, because you're away from home. The weather may not be the most agreeable. If you're in the Northeast or the Midwest, it can get pretty challenging just dealing with the weather. And third, you're kind of surrounded by people who are somewhat unlike you, right? Fundamentally. So all that just at a at a baseline level can be a source of some stress and anxiety from time to time. And it's really important to recognize that. I think with the passage of time, one of the good things that has come about is that people talk about mental health more actively and more openly. When I was in college, it was something that people were aware of. I would say I was aware of it, but I never thought of it as something that affected me, which in hindsight was a clear fallacy, obviously. But I think the fact that people are just more used to talking about it now means that you can discuss it with people around you, and people are well equipped to have those conversations, or at least better equipped than they were when I was in college. I never really experienced Penn's kind of mental health facilities for myself. But having had friends who did, I think they were pretty good. I mean, I only know so much, because past the point, it's an issue that it just depends on how much someone's willing to open up to you about. But from what I gather, they were pretty good then. I don't know about now. And I think in general, the attitude towards mental health has improved on I would imagine every campus in the US, just because people are aware, and administrators are aware that it's something that students often have difficulty with. I don't think Penn was perfect. I don't think any school is. We had undergrads that dropped out. We had undergrads that committed suicide. Sorry to say, I know it's not the most pleasant news, but these things happen in college, and you kind of have to find a way of dealing with it before you get to that level. So one thing that I learned post fact, but it's helpful for you guys, hopefully, is just learn when to speak up. And it's the easiest thing in the world to imagine that you're the only person going through a certain set of difficult circumstances, but in reality, you probably aren't. And if you speak up, it kind of helps people around you focus their time and effort on you, and it also helps kind of people in the school in general know that you need help and that you're asking for it. So yeah, that would be my brief advice on and take on mental health in colleges in the US.
Absolutely, I think that's something we have to always keep in mind. So maybe now transitioning to academics. So before college at TISB, what subjects did you study in the IB, and how did this affect your academic experience in college? Also, I think some other alumni have told us about college credit that you can get from IB courses. So if you have any experience with that, please tell us about that as well.
Yeah. Okay, so what I studied and how it helped, and then college credits. I'll start with college credits because I'll forget otherwise. So yes, you can get credit for I think mostly for higher level subjects that you take in the IB. Although the kind of frustrating part is that it can vary by college. There's no set standard because colleges have a large amount of freedom when it comes to deciding what's good enough and what's not good enough. So you find a lot of advanced AP classes, for example, are treated as being equivalent to freshman level classes in college. So people can place out of those classes using their AP results. But the IB, at least when I joined, was not. It was well known, but not as well understood as the AP, just because it's an American system and people get it. So I placed out of something using my physics IB credit. I think I placed out of like an intro level physics class using my physics HL credit from the IB, but they stopped allowing that the year after I joined. So I think my year at Penn was the last year that was allowed to place out of intro physics using IB credits. I don't know if that has changed again since. I haven't kept track, but that's something that you should. I guess if you're interested in doing that, that's something that you only really have a better idea of once you know which college you're going to. And I'd say really honestly, it's not that big a deal if you have to take those classes again. Might as well have, if you have a couple of classes in your freshman year that you're already pretty good with content-wise, then that can be pretty helpful because it gives you more time to focus on other things. Because you're already dealing with a lot. So it's not the worst thing in the world to have a couple of classes that you already kind of understand and know how to deal with conceptually. So that was about placement. Coming back to IB subjects, I studied, as you can imagine probably, being an engineering major. I studied physics, chem, and math higher level, and my standard level subjects were French B, English, and economics. So I'd say in terms of what I studied and how it helped me in college, obviously I had a pretty solid theoretical base in physics and math and chemistry when I came to college to study engineering, which is basically physics and math and chemistry. So it helped me in that sense. I do think though something I could have done in the IB is, this is essentially my lack of awareness then is, and knowing that I was interested more in physics and math than chemistry, maybe I could have taken chemistry down to SL and economics up to HL, just because that would have been I think a slightly easier and more interesting mix for me personally. But I think it really did prepare me because it was pretty intense in terms of workload and time required. So it prepared me in kind of a pretty crucial way for college, because it just taught me that there's no substitute for putting in the work and trying to really understand what you're dealing with before you come to a point where you're kind of tested on it. So I'd say my curriculum helped me with the curriculum I picked in the IB, helped me form kind of a good theoretical base of knowledge for college. And then it also helped me form the habits that I would need in college when it came to dealing with similarly challenging subjects.
So that's good to know. Hopefully our IB course will help us as well. So at college, how many hours of lectures and homework did you have per week? And was the workload manageable? And do you have any personal tips on keeping up with the academic work?
Sorry, I just got an error saying you may not be able to hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We can.
Okay, perfect. Sorry. Right. So in terms of managing workload, and sorry, could you repeat your question, Abhigyan, because I was slightly distracted by the error message.
Absolutely, absolutely. So how many hours of lectures and homework did you have per week? And was the workload manageable? And do you have any tips for us as to how to manage the workload?
Yeah, I had, in terms of hours of lecture, it varies somewhat depending on the term. I think on average, I must have had heavily ballparking this, 8 to 10 hours, I would imagine, of lecture through the week. It wasn't very intense. It was actually pretty manageable because you have lectures can be 50 minutes or 80 minutes. That at Penn, this depends, changes with other schools, I think. But at Penn, it was 50 minutes or 80 minutes, and 50 minutes was kind of the standard. And you took about, and per class, each class would have lectures thrice a week, so 3 hours. You took about 4 or 5 classes, so actually more like 12 or 15 hours. Sorry, my estimate was wrong. So 12 to 15 hours in lecture, depending on your workload. And then additionally, you have recitations, which are basically run by the TA. So the lectures are taught by a professor, and then you have an hour a week, which is recitation, which is taught by a TA who's normally a PhD student or a graduate student. And they help you kind of cover what was taught during the week and answer any questions you have about the content that you covered. But that's basically just the time you spend in a classroom. You have to spend obviously a lot more time than that because you're given assignments, and then a lot of times you have kind of lab work that you're expected to do on your own time. There's no like assigned time for it on your calendar. So you're expected to find time with your teammates and kind of just figure it out between yourselves. So all in, it can take a lot of time away from you, which is kind of the point, right? You're there to study. What helped me manage workload was, honestly, I don't think I managed my workload very well for the first probably 2 years. It sounds kind of crazy because that's 50% of your experience. So it was something that I just wasn't as good at as I thought I would be. So, and having thought about that with the benefit of hindsight, I think something I could have done better, and something I would kind of advise people to do is pay attention to how you're spending your time, because time management is vital. And like there's always things you want to do and things you should be doing. And it's very hard to always do the thing you should be doing, but I think you should try and weigh your average quite heavily towards the things you should be doing, because that's essentially the only way you can keep up. Because there's every week there's always something or the other happening, and then you start your term, and before you know it, midterms are there, and then before you know it, it's time for finals. And if you haven't been doing all the work consistently, it's very hard to cram for finals. So that definitely is not the strategy I would recommend, which is what I ended up doing my first year and a half. Wasn't very successful. So I'd say my tips would be start every week, kind of with a clear idea of, or actually end a week with a very clear idea of what's coming up in the week ahead. So I guess on a Friday afternoon or even Saturday morning, if you wake up and kind of look at your calendar for the next week or two and kind of figure out what's due when, and work backward from there to figure out when you need to start working on it and when it needs to be done by, that would make your life a lot easier. And then obviously stick to that schedule as far as possible because anyone can make a plan. So that would be my advice, is get really good at figuring out what is due when on kind of chronological level, and figure out how much time you'll need, and that you'll get better at as you progress. But allocate a nice chunk of time to finishing out the important things, and then just execute relentlessly against that plan, because the more you do that, the better your chances of actually staying on top of the workload.
Absolutely. And I think a part of time management is also so that we're able to find time to do things outside of our major, outside of our academics. So
absolutely.
I think you mentioned rowing. So how did you personally find time to pursue personal interests other than your time management? And maybe what did you do while you were at college?
Yeah, I mean, so rowing is actually a pretty poor example, because at some levels that's what contributed massively to my time management issues. But it's a good example also because of that. So I'll start with kind of a brief overview of the things I did outside the classroom, and then we can jump into a couple that I think are useful. So I freshman year I got there, and I was like, I have to do something athletic. Like, I'm not the most athletic person you'll meet, but I like having that as an outlet. And I tried out for the football team, which is kind of what I like to play in my free time, but I was nowhere near good enough. And then I was basically walking back from those tryouts when I ran into these two like 6'7", incredibly jacked, muscular guys, and they just look at me and they go, do you want to try out for the rowing team? And I was like, sure. I mean, I don't think I'll be very good at it. I've never really stepped foot in a rowing boat before, but yeah, why not? So went to the tryouts, did badly, but not really badly enough to get cut. And over time, just kind of put in the work relentlessly. Woke up at 5 every morning, which TISB had prepared me for. So I woke up at 5 every morning, went to the gym with the team, worked out, rowed, got back, had breakfast, went to class, got done with class, went back to the row house, got into a boat, rowed some more, came back to my dorm. And that is theoretically the time that I should have started studying, but I was too tired, so I would sleep at like 9 p.m. So that went on for a while, and that made me realize that it was essentially unsustainable, because I was doing something that mostly student athletes do. And what I mean by that is these are people who've come to college with kind of the explicit knowledge that they are there just to compete athletically, right? Like the college gets them there on a scholarship, and the whole point is that they are there to boost the college's rankings in different athletic leagues, and the college doesn't really care how they do academically. I mean, that's a cynical oversimplification, but that's kind of true. And so I was with them, right? But like I was not them. in the sense that I was not there on an athletic scholarship, and I was there to study really and kind of do well and get a job out of it at the end. But that took me a while to realize, and that wreaked havoc on my schedule for the first year, basically. And then I had to take a step back and drop the rowing team because it was either that or studying, and I knew I knew which one I had to pick. Other things I did that I found really interesting during my time were I was a big part of the South Asian theater group at Penn. I'd never really done any acting at any level before, so I thought that this would be interesting. I was always interested in plays, in the IB and before that in terms of reading material. But this was a good kind of practical experience of that. So I ended up acting in 2 plays, one of which I was the lead, and then just kind of stuck with it on a non-acting level. So I found it interesting to do kind of the administrative side of it and the marketing side of it. So ended up broadening the reach of the theater club to more than just South Asian students at Penn, and ended up getting other international and American students in as actors, so that their friends would come and that their communities kind of essentially are aware of this one club and its existence. And the other thing that I did that I really enjoyed was just playing football with my friends. So there was a set routine for that. And Penn had good facilities to allow that. So we would play every week if we could. There were some weeks we couldn't, but pretty much every week. And that was a very good kind of buffer time away from everything else, where you could just have some fun. And it was there as an outlet, basically. So yeah, I would say outside of rowing, the activity I dedicated most of my time to was the theater club, the South Asian theater group at Penn, and then like a smattering of other things, but not really intense enough for them to matter at a time management level.
That's some great advice, and it's really interesting to hear about the diversity of your experiences. So on another note, do you think that your college education, whether at Penn or at Sloan, has provided you with the skills you require in the industry you work in right now?
So college education, yes. And the way I think about that is I studied something that was, fairly quantitative or very quantitative actually. And what that gave me was kind of just this broad understanding of how different systems work and how you can understand them at a quantitative level and how you can explore their behavior from the data that you have about them. And right out of college, I joined a small consulting firm in New York. So, it was nothing to do with engineering per se. Like all of my clients were small companies owned by private equity funds that needed to turn them around quickly, turn their operations around quickly. But where my toolkit helped me was, being able to look at massive chunks of internal company data and make sense of them quickly and explain what it meant to people around me, and drive towards a set of, actions that we could take to make things better. So that's definitely where it helped me. I also think Penn, amongst some other schools, does a very good job at just having pre-professional things in place. So, for example, as a part of their on-campus recruiting process, you get to do a lot of kind of mock interviews, and you get to talk to a lot of alumni about their industries and their experiences. So it does kind of help prepare you at a mental level for what work life is like. But ultimately, the best teacher is actually doing it. So I'd say Penn helped me a fair bit in terms of giving me a skill set that I could use, and also in terms of giving me a fair idea of what to expect once I started working. Business school is inherently kind of different because chances are you worked for anywhere from 3 to 5 or 7 years before you come to business school. So I'd worked for 5 years before I joined. And you not only have hopefully a clear idea of what you don't want to do after school, you hopefully have a good idea of what you would like to do after school. And the whole point of business school is not really the academics, although there are some people who make it about the academics, and that's also kind of a fair thing to do if you want to. But the whole point of the 2 years here is to use it as a sandbox and kind of explore things that you're interested in and come away with, okay, this is what I want to do at least for the next, I don't know, 2, 3, 5 years, whatever it may be. So in very different ways, yes, they prepared me for professional life.
Perfect. I mean, because I think a lot of people do have that concern nowadays that industries are so fast-paced and things, evolve so quickly that is your college degree even useful by the time you get into industry?
I think you should definitely expect, sorry, I know I cut you off, but I would say to that, because you touched on something interesting, I think you should definitely expect that not all of what you will learn in college is strictly applicable or even required to do the job that you want to do or that you end up doing. But I think if you do college right, some of the skills that you come away with are, how to communicate orally and on a written level, which is both very important, and how to think really at some level, because that's the whole point of kind of the liberal arts approach to things, is teaching people how to think from first principles. And if you have both of those, I'd say you're set for pretty much any job you'd want to do, because most jobs you join out of undergrad will have some sort of training in place to kind of ground you in the fundamentals of the business and the industry and the way it operates. But what you bring to that in terms of your existing kind of skill set can have a massive impact on where you land up.
Right. Yeah, I think that's another important thing to keep in mind. So I think one last question before we go to the audience questions, because there's quite a few of those.
Okay.
So when you were at Penn, how did you find internships and things like that? And how did that help you choose what you wanted to do in the future with your career?
Yeah, sure. So I'd say, and I think Penn does this really well. I think other schools sometimes struggle with this, so it just comes down to where you go. But Penn has a very solid network of undergrad alumni who work in, broadly speaking, very vast kind of range of fields. And what the school did well was have companies come to campus to present to undergrads, what the company was about, what they did, how to recruit for them, etc. And like some of those companies, I wanted to join but couldn't because, say, I wanted to work at Boeing, but you have to be a U.S. citizen basically, so didn't happen. But some companies, I found interesting and applied to and interned with them, like Morgan Stanley, which is an investment bank. And there the school was really helpful because, these companies come to your school to recruit because they have alumni from your school working in the company who kind of perpetuate that cycle. And the way that Penn helped me recruit for those openings is just giving me exposure to those alumni and having kind of a very organized system in place that helped me find people in fields I was interested in and talk to them and ask if they had, space for internships or if they had a program of some sort that allowed them to hire interns. So I would say that's, and then of course the mock interviews, resume editing, all of that is done by the career services office of your university. All of that is very, very important to take advantage of because everyone else is doing it, and you need to look kind of as polished as possible to be able to get your foot in the door. And then once you have an interview, it's kind of it's kind of up to you in terms of how much you prep and how things turn out on the day.
That's something we'll definitely take into account and remember. So now moving on to the audience questions, Vishnu asks, how freely were you able to pursue courses in areas you were passionate about, especially if they were not directly related to your major?
Yeah, pretty freely, I would say. And I think some of this depends on where you go to college, actually. And by where, I mean US versus UK primarily, from my experience. So I have friends who study in the US and studied in the UK. I think the UK system, just because it's, it's a 3-year bachelor's degree, you don't have as much freedom to kind of move around and explore things. Whereas with the US system, most colleges, you don't even have to declare a major until kind of you're halfway through your second year. So it gives you a fair bit of variety, a fair bit of freedom to like explore different options. So I definitely had that freedom and I used it. I didn't explore different options per se as much as I just took classes in different academic fields that interested me. So I took, as I said, I minored in entrepreneurship, which was actually a minor run by the engineering school. So that was interesting. I did a lot of history classes because I find history interesting. I did some South Asian studies classes. Those were mostly for the A's, but they were also somewhat interesting. And I did, what else did I do that was interesting? I did a few Wharton classes because they have, you can register for them as long as they aren't at capacity. So I ended up taking, introductory finance, accounting, macroeconomics, and negotiations, and all of those, and business ethics, and all of those were very solid classes and definitely informed my worldview. So I'd say it depends on the college, but mostly speaking, US colleges do a better job of that than UK colleges.
Perfect. And someone asks, what were the extracurriculars and scores that got you into UPenn, if you're comfortable sharing them?
Yeah, I don't mind sharing them at all, but I do have a hard time remembering some of them. So let's see, my IB final was, well, the final doesn't really matter because you get in on your predicted grades. And I don't know what my predicted grades were, but I'd imagine they were like close-ish to my final grades. So my final grade was a 38 on 42, and then I got a 1 out of 3, which was kind of disappointing. So 39 overall. And SAT, I think I had my first attempt was this was about 2400. I think they changed it back to 16 and then back to 24 now. So I don't know how comparable it is, but the first attempt was a 2080, and then my second attempt was a 2210. And I think math and critical reading were my stronger sections, and writing was my weaker section. And then the SAT subject tests, I think I got an 800 in all of them except chemistry, something like that. But chemistry wasn't even that relevant to what I was applying to. So those were my scores broadly. If there are any others that I'm missing, please let me know.
No, this was quite exhaustive actually. So okay. We have someone asking, in what ways were the mechanical engineering and MBA courses different? So I think you can talk about it in terms of like the rigor of the class, which one was more hands-on, etc.
They were very different. Yeah, I mean, engineering classes are just more rigorous in general because the concepts are, at least to me, the concepts are more challenging and kind of require more work to understand and be able to apply. Whereas most business school classes, if you're aware of the world around you, chances are you have enough knowledge to kind of do well. There are obviously technical classes like accounting and finance and econ that you just, they're based on something that's quantitative and you have to understand the logic before you can apply the concepts. But then classes like strategy, for example, or that comes down to how interested you are in the topic and how much you know about it, right? And how much you're willing to read and learn. And so it's not maybe as rigorous, but it still requires effort if you want to do well. So I would say they're rigorous in different ways. Again, the whole point of business school isn't academics, whereas the whole point of undergrad is. So it's not an apples to apples comparison, and that's where the differences come in.
Right, of course. So I think the last question is, when you were speaking about diversification in terms of the college choices, did you mean environment, selectivity, and or location?
Oh, I actually hadn't thought about that as much. I guess I would mean mostly selectivity. Just going by my own experience, because location, I guess, if it's important to you, is something you should definitely concentrate, I guess, because if you know for sure you won't like a place, what's the point really of struggling through it for 4 years? But I was thinking more from a selectivity point of view, because the application process, no matter how kind of good you are academically and extracurriculars wise, and kind of how well positioned you think you might be, it's ultimately just random at so many levels, which I hope is not disappointing for you all to hear, but it's kind of a fact of life, honestly. So I would say, yeah, diversify. I meant selectivity, but definitely you can apply that across different dimensions if they're important to you.
Okay, so we have one last question, like it came in just now. So how would college and perhaps work life for you have been different if you'd pursued math and economics as your core subjects?
As my HL subjects, or as
I
kind of my
think
main
in
course?
undergrad. I think
undergrad.
I think as your majors.
I mean, hard to say. Math is pretty demanding, as far as an undergrad degree goes. And I like math, but I was not really that into it, honestly. Econ is also challenging because of the number of people that study it, and a lot of them are pretty smart. I don't know how much it would have changed in terms of the amount of time I spent on my academic work. I think it would have likely been as intense. I think what it would have changed maybe is when I was applying for jobs, how I was perceived versus others. So when I was applying for finance roles out of undergrad, there was an understanding that engineers could do them, but it was just easier for the Wharton kids to get those jobs because they study the same things. Whereas I think if you're an econ major, they do look at that as fairly comparable to studying business undergrad, or at least studying finance undergrad. So maybe on the margins, it affects kind of how you're looked at by certain employers. But macro, I don't think it would change that much, because you're still studying like math, which is the foundation of engineering, really. So maybe you're not studying, maybe you don't have the same component of practical lab work. That would be something that I miss probably, because once you're in the liberal arts curriculum, there isn't a lot of lab work involved, or if there is, it's very different from like actual physical lab work. So yeah, maybe that would be the biggest change, is not having kind of practically oriented classes within your curriculum.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So I think we're done with the questions that we have for today.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah. So thank you so much for spending your time with us and telling us all about Penn and your experience at college.
Not at all. Thank you.
So before we end, is there anything you would like to say?
I mean, honestly, applying to college is, it's been done a million times before. Please don't be stressed by the process. I mean, it's easy for me to say, I know, because I'm old and I'm done with it. But please don't stress yourself out much more than is absolutely required, and look to your peers and to your guidance counselors for help. That is something that you should kind of just actively do to be able to get better at how you present your application finally. So that would be my advice. Kind of take it, don't make it as important. You go to college somewhere and it will be good, and take help from people around you, because it can open up different pathways that you hadn't thought of.
Perfect. So again, thank you so much for being here and answering all our questions. And I think, so again, yeah, thank you, Ms. Priya, Ms. Kate, and Mr. Pavan as well for sorting out everything and allowing us to conduct these webinars. And thank you to everyone who attended. I think we're just going to end this now. Harsh, do you mind if there's any additional questions from the audience if we forward them to your email?
Not at all, please go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much again. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you, Harsh. Yeah.